So right now, what I'm going to refer to as a good management practice, a project management practice for everyone, is go to your Project Management Institute guide. They have a very good documentation on project management. And you can also visit their website at www.pmi.org. The reference, and which I also use for this presentation, is the PM book. That's the Project Management Knowledge Areas 7th edition. So most of the lectures that I'll be presenting today comes from this organization and from the documentation that they normally publish, which in this case is the PM book. So what is a project, right? So a project is a temporary endeavor undertaking to create a unique product, service, or result. In this case, our unique service would be ORAN, or mobile network connectivity, which we will normally offer to the public, right? So when you see a project, it should be a temporary undertaking. What do I mean by a temporary? When you say that a project or a project comes to you, normally you have a beginning and it should end, right? Uh, a project could be a long duration, it could be short duration, but at least it should have a beginning and an end. So there's no such thing as an ongoing project. For example, if you guys would be assigned to deploy an ORAN network, right? Somewhere you have to finish the project, close it, and turn it over to operations. After that, the project should be closed. It should cease to exist, right? All those concerns about maintaining it, or if there's a fault after you have completed the project, it should be under operations already. So a different team should be handling that. So please remember this. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique service or result. So in our case, since we are dealing with ORAN, uh, it's a very complex, right? So it can involve multiple projects, right? So when I say multiple projects, so the deployment of an ORAN platform will be a program. So when I say it's a program, there will be so many projects under that program, and those related projects will have to be completed in parallel or maybe one after another. But the ultimate goal is the objective of the program, and that is to deploy an optimized and efficient ORAN environment. So what is the project life cycle of any project? So these are the 5 basic project phases. Initiating, someone has to, your business sponsor or maybe a major stakeholder is planning to, put up his own mobile network. So that would be his concept, right? And in the initiation phase, he needs to write down all the requirements that he needs for this new mobile platform. After the initiation phase, that's the time when most of the stakeholders comes to the table and plan what will they do next, right? And after the planning stage and documenting everything in the planning stage, then they will go to the execution phase. But in between planning and execution phase, so that you will have a successful execution, you have to monitor and control the variables when you're doing the project. Those variables we will discuss later on. Once you have done your execution, as I've said, a project is temporary. It should have an ending. So once the full project has been completed, maybe up to the last bolt that has to be installed, then you have to gather again all the stakeholders and you will have to agree to close the project. So that's the complete life cycle of the project. So it's initiation, planning, execution, and then closing. And in between, you have to control it and monitor it for, of course, if there are issues along the way. So as I've said, you can refer to the PM book guide, and there are knowledge areas in that PM book guide for every major uh, area that you have any doubts on how to implement it. For example, how you can gather scope, how you can manage the time of a project, how to produce or come up with a good costing of any project, how you would implement quality on each document that you are going to produce for this project. And of course, HR management, because HR would be the one that you have to go to if you will have to require resources that will be under this project. And the next one is communication management. Sometimes this is not being taken seriously. But remember, as the project goes along, you have to publish status reports, right? And you should have a communication plan on how to publish that status report. And the next one is risk management. As you implement the project, there are going to be risks involved in it. For example, if you procure items that are required in the project, there are instances that the procured materials would be delayed because there would be supply chain issues, right? For example, during the pandemic, what happened? All of the materials that are being imported in from Europe or US has limitations because the pandemic has stopped most of the manufacturing at their major plants. And the next area would be procurement management, which of course you have to speak to your procurement team or buyers, as we call them in the corporate organization, because they will be the ones securing the contracts and issuing POs to your vendors. And the last area, which is really important, is the project integration area, because this is where all the things that you will have to do and manage the vendors and contractors that will be involved in your project. So all of this you will encounter within the phases of your project. During the phase of the project, you will encounter all of these knowledge areas. So when doing project management, normally there are three major constraints, right? That will always be there that you need to address. Most of the time, you will have limitations in time because the project schedule might be too aggressive. You can also have some issues with your scope because sometimes the scope that was initially published will have to be changed because the requirements have changed. Maybe, for example, the area that a mobile network will serve was previously conceptualized as only part of Luzon, but later on, the owner might have decided, oh no, we will have to also cover parts of Visayas or something like that. So scope can change, right? And then the most glaring constraint that we normally encounter in doing a project are resources. Sometimes you will always have limitations in your deployment, especially engineers, technicians, and even project managers, right? So you have to make a balance out of these three major constraints. So you have to watch out for the time, your schedule, the scope, the cost, and then of course your resources. And by the way, all of these triple constraints is a primary responsibility of the PM that's assigned to it, including the project engineers. So we have already discussed the cycle of doing a project, right? So we have the initiating, which is to clarify the request and objectives. So here you will have to define the requirements thoroughly. And then you will go to the planning phase. Here you will have to develop the specific approach on how you're going to deploy the project. For example, are you going to do it in phases? Are you going to do a pilot before you do the rollout? So these are all the things that you have to discuss during the planning stage. And then, of course, in the execution, this is normally monitoring and controlling. So most of the tasks that will be done in rolling out your project will have to be monitored if they are within schedule, and you have to take action if there are some major delays. And once the execution phase is done or the full deployment is completed, then everybody or all the major stakeholders have to sit together and review and agree that the project is already completed and you will have to close it. And all expectations have been met based on the defined requirements during your planning. And of course, during closing, you also need to document all the lessons that you have learned during the project deployment. So what are some of the struggles often experienced by major practitioners of doing projects? Most of the time it's about the scope requirements, right? So when we do the scope for any given project, we really need to spend some time to review the project requirements, because all of the requirements should be included in the scope. For example, how many cell sites you are going to deploy, how many servers are you going to deploy, which areas are going to be covered. So this is a continuous review before you publish the document and agree that this is the only scope of our project. Otherwise, if you will not have a good scoping of your project or getting the requirements of your project, you will struggle implementing your project because the scope will always change. So it's like, when you're doing programming in a computer, garbage in, garbage out, right? So in the initial phase of your project, you should be able to nail down the scope of the project. So as I've said, you need to clarify the requests, what are the requirements, the initiative that they want to implement. When we say initiative, it's the goal or the objective of the project. Next, you have to make sure that every major stakeholder is involved in the project, even the smallest or maybe the least recognized business sponsor. And as I've shown in the diagram, there's a microscope. You need to do clarification all the time to define the requirements. So these are the major things that you have to watch out during your initiation phase.